So if you've just come from Easter Sunday Mass, or maybe you're preparing for it,
Yeah.
you feel that shift, right? From the quiet intensity of Good Friday to, well, the sheer joy of Easter morning.
Absolutely. It's such a cornerstone of Christian belief, celebrating Jesus' resurrection after, the crucifixion by the Romans way back around 30 AD.
And the whole lead up is so powerful. You've got Lent, that whole 40 days of reflection, prayer, sacrifice.
Hmm.
Then Holy Week itself, Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper, Good Friday's starkness, Holy Saturday's quiet, and then boom, Easter.
Yeah, this incredible sense of hope.
But have you ever, paused during the service, maybe during the readings, and wondered about the history packed into it all? What else is going on beneath the surface of these traditions?
That's a great question because Easter, even though it's so central to Christianity, its history is really layered. It actually connects back to much older traditions, older ways of seeing the world. So while the Christian meaning is obviously paramount for believers, looking at that historical context, it can really add another dimension. We'll definitely get into the core Christian celebration today, but also some of those surprising older connections.
Okay, cool. And we've got some great material to help us explore this. We've looked at some YouTube documentaries, one on possible pagan roots, another on Easter's general history.
Right. And Wikipedia pages, too, giving overviews of Easter itself and how Christians view the Old Covenant.
Plus articles from History and Britannica for more context, the actual Easter Sunday Mass readings from the USCCB.
And even a Wikipedia entry on the difficult history of anti-Semitism within Christianity. It's quite a range.
It is. So let's start right where the celebration really peaks for many Christians, inside the Easter Sunday Mass.
Okay. The readings for Easter Sunday Mass, they're set out in the lectionary, number 42. They really capture the heart of it. The first reading, it's from Acts.
Right, Acts 10.
Yeah, and it's Peter speaking. He gives this powerful testimony about the Jesus, his life, his work, his death, and crucially, the resurrection.
He really emphasizes the witnesses, doesn't he?
He does. He specifically says they ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. It makes it sound so real. Grounded, not just an idea, but an event people experience.
Yeah, it really brings it down to earth, not just like a spiritual concept, but actual encounters. Then there's the Psalm, Psalm 118.
Well, that's pure joy, isn't it? This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it.
Exactly. It talks about God's power, his victory, and that image, the cornerstone image.
The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Yeah, it's all about triumph coming from unexpected places, a total reversal.
And for this second reading, there's a choice.
Correct. You might hear the reading from Colossians, which is very focused on the heavenly perspective. Seeking things above, life hidden with Christ, future glory.
Right, looking upwards.
Or the alternative is from 1 Corinthians. That one connects things very directly to Passover.
Ah, the Paschal Lamb reference.
Exactly. It urges believers to clear out the old yeast and celebrate with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, calling Christ our Paschal Lamb who has been sacrificed. It links the resurrection right back to that Exodus tradition.
And what about the sequence? That hymn, Victime Paschali Laudes.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's like a mini drama in song. It paints this picture of a battle between death and life, the lamb redeeming the sheep, and then Mary Magdalene's testimony.
Christ, my hope is arisen.
Precisely. She speaks of the empty tomb, the angels, the glory. It builds everything towards that central belief.
And the Alleluia verse seems to echo that 1 Corinthians reading too.
It does. Christ, our Paschal Lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us then feast with joy in the Lord. It's all reinforcing that joyful proclamation.
And then the gospel itself from John.
John 20. Mary Magdalene finding the tomb empty in the dark, running to tell Peter and the other disciple.
The one Jesus loved.
Right. And they run to the tomb. And there's that detail about the burial cloths.
Yeah, I always find that fascinating. The linen cloths lying there, but the head covering rolled up separately.
It suggests something orderly happened, doesn't it? Not a grave robbery, more like someone deliberately tidying up after themselves almost.
And then that key line. The other disciple goes in, he saw and believed, even though they didn't fully get the scriptures yet about him needing to rise.
Exactly. So, taken together, these readings really lay out the absolute core of the Christian celebration. The event, the witness, the interpretation, and the resulting joy of the resurrection.
Okay, so that's the theological heart, the Christian core. But you mentioned layers, older connections. This is where things start to get really interesting historically, right?
This is where you see how traditions can absorb and adapt things over time. A big clue is the timing of Easter itself.
It moves around each year.
Right. It's not a fixed date like Christmas. It's tied to the lunar cycle the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox.
Which lines up with when older pagan festivals often happened.
Precisely. As Christianity spread into Europe, it encountered cultures deeply connected to agricultural cycles and the changing seasons. Spring was already a huge deal, a time of renewal, rebirth.
So aligning Easter with that time made sense, made it easier for people to adopt the new faith.
It likely helped, yeah. It provided a familiar rhythm. These pagan festivals celebrated the return of light and life after winter. Placing Easter then allowed the church to tap into that existing sense of renewal, giving it a new Christian meaning. It wasn't just strategic, though. It speaks to that fundamental human response to the seasons, mapping beliefs onto nature cycles.
That makes sense. It's less about replacing, maybe more about reframing.
In many ways, yes. And you see that especially with some of the symbols you mentioned Austria earlier.
Yeah, the Germanic goddess Ostara.
Associated with spring, dawn, light. And her supposed symbols are very familiar. The hare and the egg.
The Easter bunny and Easter eggs.
Exactly. The hare, known for its fertility, and the egg, a near-universal symbol of creation and new life. These were potent symbols in pre-Christian spring celebrations.
So the Christian story of resurrection, new life from the tomb, it kind of resonated with those existing symbols.
It found a natural echo. The resurrection narrative offered a powerful new layer of meaning for these ancient emblems of rebirth. It wasn't just Ostri either. Think about Greek myths like Persephone returning from the underworld each spring, that theme of life, overcoming death, returning from darkness. It's a recurring human story.
So it wasn't just symbols, but maybe practices too. Did actual pagan rituals get adapted?
It seems likely. Things like spring rites involving planting seeds, lighting bonfires for purification or warmth, making offerings for fertility, these kinds of activities were common.
And you can kind of see parallels in some Easter customs.
You can. The egg, as we said, became a symbol of the empty tomb. Processions that might have once honored fertility gods could have evolved into Easter parades. Feasts marking the equinox became feasts celebrating the resurrection.
What about decorating the eggs, like those incredibly detailed Pysanky eggs in Eastern Europe? They feel ancient.
They are. The practice of decorating eggs is very old and existed in many cultures before Christianity arrived. Those Pysanky, for instance, have roots in pre-Christian Slavic traditions, often tied to rituals for spring and protection.
So Christianity adopted the practice but changed the meaning.
Pretty much. The intricate designs continued, but the symbolism shifted. Red eggs became common, representing Christ's blood shed for humanity, but also the joy of the resurrection.
And the egg hunt, just a bit of fun for kids or...
Well, it's hard to say definitively, but some folklorists suggest it might echo older rituals of searching for signs of new life and fertility in the spring fields. A playful version of seeking renewal, perhaps.
Okay, and the lamb, the Easter lamb dinner.
The lamb. That has multiple layers. Jesus is called the Lamb of God in the New Testament, taking away the sin of the world.
Right.
But the lamb was already a hugely important sacrificial animal in Jewish tradition, especially for Passover, which is happening around the same time.
So it connects to both.
Exactly. The tradition of blessing and eating lamb at Easter goes way back, linking the Passover history, the sacrificial imagery, and the specific Christian interpretation of Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice. So you see this constant blending. But it's important to note, this merging wasn't always smooth. There were debates in the early church about adopting these practices.
Right. It shows that cultural exchange is complex, not always straightforward. Okay, shifting focus a bit. Our sources mention different ways Christians understand the Old Covenant, the Law of Moses. How does that fit into this picture?
It's relevant because it touches on the relationship between Christianity and its Jewish roots, which is, well, complicated. Christian views on the Old Covenant laws vary quite a bit.
Okay.
Generally, most agree the moral law, think the Ten Commandments still holds. But views differ on the ceremonial laws, like dietary rules or temple sacrifices, and the civil laws given to ancient Israel.
So it's not all seen as applying in the same way today.
Not universally, no. For example, Lutheran traditions often divide the law into moral, civil, and ceremonial, arguing only the moral law remains fully binding on Christians. Reformed traditions, with covenant theology, also see the moral law continuing, but view the ceremonial aspects as fulfilled in Christ.
Okay, so there's continuity but also fulfillment. Are there views that see more of a break?
Yes. Some forms of dispensationalism, for instance, see the Mosaic Law as specifically for Israel and largely set aside for the church age, replaced by what they call the law of Christ.
And what's the law of Christ generally?
It usually refers to the ethical teachings of Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament. Then you also have New Covenant theology, which argues Christ fulfilled all the Old Covenant laws, replacing them entirely with the law of Christ. So how Christians relate to the New Testament law is quite diverse.
It definitely sounds like there's no single monolithic view. And this leads us into a really difficult and frankly much darker area that our sources cover: the history of anti-Semitism and its connection to Christian beliefs.
Yeah, this is a really tough but necessary part of understanding the broader historical context. Sadly, anti-Semitism within Christian history goes back a long way, sometimes reflecting even older pre-Christian prejudices.
What was the main driver, according to the sources?
A major tragic factor was the accusation of Jewish deicide, the idea that Jewish people collectively, across all time, were responsible for Jesus' death.
That's a horrifying accusation.
It is, and it's rooted in interpretations of certain gospel passages, particularly in Matthew. This idea fueled centuries of discrimination and violence. It's been incredibly damaging.
The sources detail a grim history: ostracism, violence, forced conversions, expulsions, ultimately culminating in the Holocaust.
It's a sobering history. Interestingly, in the very early days, Christians were persecuted by the Romans, and sometimes Jewish authorities, wanting to distance themselves, might have contributed to that by denying Christians were Jews. But once Christianity became the religion of the empire—
The power dynamic completely flipped.
Exactly. And that's when the institutional persecution of Jews, often justified by theology, really took hold.
You mentioned the deicide charge coming from Matthew. Has that view changed?
Thankfully, yes. Many Christian denominations today have explicitly repudiated the idea of collective Jewish guilt for Jesus' death. They recognize it as a harmful misinterpretation.
What about the criticisms of the Pharisees in the New Testament? Did that play a role?
It did, unfortunately. The Gospels record debates and criticisms Jesus had with some Pharisees. These were arguably internal Jewish debates at the time. But later interpretations often took these specific criticisms and wrongly applied them as a blanket condemnation of all Jews throughout history.
Even though modern rabbinic Judaism actually evolved from the Pharisaic tradition.
Precisely. And it wasn't just later interpreters. Some very influential early church fathers, figures like Tertullian, Origen, Jerome, Ephraim the Syrian, wrote things that were strongly anti-Jewish.
Really? That early on?
Yes. Tertullian argued God had rejected the Jews. Origen blamed them for Christ's death. These writings carried immense authority and shaped Christian attitudes for centuries, creating this deep theological divide and hostility.
And the source material lays out a timeline of how this manifested.
It does. In the Middle Ages, you had papal restrictions, terrible violence like the Rhineland massacres during the First Crusade, and mass expulsions from England, France, Spain.
Spanish Inquisition era.
Right. Then the Renaissance saw the creation of ghettos, forcing Jews into segregated areas, like the one established by Pope Paul IV in Rome, with a bold cum nimbus absurdum. More restrictions, more forced conversions.
Even Martin Luther during the Reformation.
Initially, he hoped to convert Jews, but when that didn't happen, his later writings became viciously anti-Semitic, sadly adding fuel to the fire.
And this continued for centuries.
It did. Discriminatory laws persisted. In the 18th and 19th centuries, you saw the rise of racial anti-Semitism, adding another layer onto the religious anti-Judaism.
Which brings us closer to the 20th century and the Holocaust. How do the sources connect Christian anti-Semitism to Nazi ideology?
It's a very complex relationship. Historians are clear that Nazi ideology was primarily racial, not religious. However, the argument is that centuries of Christian anti-Judaism created a cultural environment where Jews were already seen as other, distrusted, and dehumanized.
So it sort of paved the way, made people more susceptible to Nazi propaganda.
That's the argument some historians make. Not a direct cause, but a contributing factor that fostered centuries of prejudice and resistance to Jewish integration. It's also noted that the Vatican's record on protecting Jewish rights over the centuries has been, well, quite mixed.
It's a stark reminder that religious history, like all history, has these incredibly complex and often deeply troubling dimensions.
Absolutely. And understanding Easter fully means grappling not just with the joyous theology and the fascinating pagan echoes, but also with this painful legacy of how Christian beliefs were tragically misused to persecute others.
So Easter really is this rich, dense tapestry, isn't it? You've got the core Christian story of resurrection, threads of ancient seasonal celebrations woven in, and then the shadow of a long, difficult history, especially regarding Christian-Jewish relations.
Exactly. And I think acknowledging all those layers, the light and the dark, allows for a much deeper, more honest appreciation of the holiday and its journey through time. It pushes us to think about the legacies we carry.
Yeah, it really does. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How recognizing that shared human impulse, the search for renewal, for hope after darkness, expressed differently across time and cultures, how that might deepen our understanding of Easter and maybe just our shared humanity in general.
That's a really powerful thought to sit with. It certainly invites further reflection, maybe digging into early Christian history more, or how Easter evolved differently around the world, or perhaps learning more about the ongoing dialogue and reconciliation efforts between Christian and Jewish communities today. There's always more to uncover.